Richard Sterling picked up the Mont Blanc pen, the ink gleaming wet on the divorce decree, and actually chuckled. The sound bounced off the mahogany walls of the conference room, a sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, his wife of 20 years, and saw only a defeated housewife who had aged out of his interest. He thought he was walking away with his billions, his 24-year-old mistress, and his freedom. He didn't check the finer print on the holding company structure listed in Appendix C. If he had, he would have realized that the woman staring at the floor wasn't crying. She was counting. Because Richard didn't just sign a divorce paper. He just signed over control of his entire life. The ink was barely dry on the settlement papers when Richard Sterling signaled for the waiter. They were at Le Bernardin in Midtown Manhattan, a venue Richard had chosen specifically for this occasion. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the power move. He wanted Evelyn to sign the end of their marriage in the same place he had proposed to her 2 decades ago. It was cruel, unnecessary, and perfectly in character for a man who had spent the last 5 years treating his marriage like a depreciating asset he couldn't wait to offload. Champagne, Richard barked, not bothering to make eye contact with the sommelier. The 08 Dom. Make it 2 bottles. We're celebrating. Evelyn sat opposite him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress, the kind that blended into the background, much like Evelyn herself had done for the last decade of Richard's meteoric rise in the tech pharmaceutical industry. To the onlookers in the restaurant, she looked like a woman in mourning. Her shoulders were slightly slumped, her gaze fixed on the pristine white tablecloth. Richard, on the other hand, was vibrating with energy. He adjusted his bespoke suit jacket, the fabric straining slightly against the bulk he'd added from too many steak dinners and too little time in the gym, though he told everyone it was muscle. "You're making the right choice, Evie," Richard said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. He picked up the divorce decree, waving it slightly before sliding it into his leather briefcase. "Honestly, this is better for you. The alimony is generous. You get the house in Connecticut. You can finally just relax. Do whatever it is you do. Garden, paint, whatever." He laughed then, a sharp, barking sound. "God knows you were never cut out for the city life anyway. You were drowning in my shadow." Evelyn finally looked up. Her face was unreadable, her eyes devoid of the tears Richard had expected. "Is that what you think, Richard, that I was drowning?" "Look at you," Richard sneered, gesturing vaguely at her appearance. "You haven't bought a new dress in 3 seasons. You stopped coming to the galas. You let yourself go, Evie. A man in my position, I need a partner who reflects my status. Someone with vitality. Someone who understands the future." As if on cue, a vibration buzzed from Richard's pocket. He pulled out his phone and smiled a greedy, boyish grin that made him look 10 years younger and infinitely more foolish. "Is that her?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was steady, lacking the tremble of a scorned woman. "It's Isabella," Richard admitted, not even pretending to have shame. "She's waiting at the Pierre. We're flying to Street Tropez tonight. A little freedom tour. She's barely 24, Evie. She has this energy. She looks at me, and she sees a titan. You look at me, and you see, well, I don't know what you see. A paycheck, I assume." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though it was still laced with venom. "I had the lawyers lock down the shares, Evie. The prenup we signed in '98 held up. You get the cash payout, sure, but Sterling Dynamics? That's mine. Every brick, every patent, every share. My name is on the building. My blood is in the code. You don't get to touch the empire." Evelyn took a slow sip of her water. "I didn't ask for the shares, Richard. Because you knew you wouldn't get them." He slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "My legal team is the best in New York. Harrison and partners didn't leave a single loophole. You are walking away with exactly what I decided you are worth. Nothing more." The waiter arrived with the champagne. Richard grabbed a glass before the pour was even finished, raising it in a mock toast. "To the future," he said, beaming, "and to the past, knowing its place." Evelyn didn't reach for her glass. She simply watched him drink. There was a strange stillness about her, a density to her silence that Richard, in his narcotic state of ego, completely missed. He assumed she was frozen by the reality of her new irrelevance. He assumed she was terrified of a world where she wasn't Mrs. Richard Sterling. He was wrong. Richard, Evelyn said softly, did you read the addendum regarding the debt restructuring? The clause about the Titanium Holdings acquisition? Richard waved a dismissive hand. Standard boilerplate. My lawyers said it was just clearing up some old liabilities you wanted off your name. I signed it. It's done. Stop trying to find a way back in, Evie. The ink is dry. I'm not trying to find a way back in, she said, finally reaching for her purse. She stood up. She didn't look defeated anymore. In fact, as she stood, she seemed to grow taller, her posture correcting itself into a line of steel. I just wanted to make sure you enjoyed the champagne. It's the last thing you'll be expensing to the company account. Richard laughed so hard, he nearly choked. You're delusional. Go to Connecticut, Evie. Feed the birds. Evelyn walked out of Le Bernardin without looking back. Richard watched her go, shaking his head with a smirk. He pulled out his phone and texted Isabella, Done. The witch is gone. I'm all yours. He didn't know that 3 blocks away, in a sleek black SUV with tinted windows, a man named Simon Thorne, arguably the most feared forensic accountant in London, was waiting for Evelyn. As Evelyn climbed into the back seat, Simon handed her a tablet. The screen displayed a live feed of the stock market, specifically the ticker for Sterling Dynamics. He signed? Simon asked, his British accent clipped and professional. He signed, Evelyn said. Her voice had changed. The soft, mousy tone she used with Richard was gone, replaced by the cold, precise articulation of an operator. And he laughed while he did it. Simon tapped the screen. Then, it's active. The transfer of the debt obligations from Titanium Holdings to his personal estate is triggered by the divorce decree. And since Titanium Holdings secretly owns the majority voting rights of Sterling Dynamics via the shell corporations in the Caymans, well, Evelyn looked at the screen. Execute Phase 1, Simon. Freeze his corporate cards and call the board. Tell them the new majority shareholder is calling an emergency meeting for 8 a.m. tomorrow. And who should I say is calling the meeting? Simon asked, a small smile playing on his lips. Evelyn looked out the window at the passing city lights, her reflection sharp in the glass. Tell them it's Miss Moore, she said, and tell security to revoke Richard's access badge. To understand how Richard Sterling lost his empire in a single signature, you have to understand who Evelyn Moore was before she became Evelyn Sterling. Richard liked to tell people he met her when she was a secretary at his first startup. It was a convenient narrative that fit his ego, the brilliant inventor plucking the beautiful, simple girl from the typing pool. But that wasn't true. When they met in 1998, Evelyn wasn't a secretary. She was a junior analyst for a boutique risk management firm that Richard had hired to save his startup from bankruptcy. Richard was the face, the charisma, the sales pitch, the visionary. But he was terrible with money. He spent capital before he had it, leveraged assets he didn't own, and ignored tax liabilities. In those early days, it was Evelyn who stayed up until 4 a.m., rewriting his ledgers, negotiating with creditors, and creating the financial structures that allowed Sterling Tech to survive its infancy. She fell in love with his passion. He fell in love with the fact that she fixed his problems without asking for credit. When they married, she stepped back. It was the 90s, and Richard was traditional, or rather, insecure. He didn't want a wife who was smarter than him in the boardroom. He wanted a cheerleader. So, Evelyn retreated to the background. She raised their son, who was now away at boarding school in Switzerland. She managed the estates, and she played the role of the quiet socialite. But she never stopped watching the money. The turning point came 4 years ago. It was a Tuesday. Evelyn had gone to Richard's office to surprise him with lunch, a rare gesture she attempted to rekindle their fading connection. She walked past his assistant, who looked terrified, and opened the door to his private suite. She didn't catch him in bed with someone. It was worse. She found him on a conference call, with his inner circle, a group of sycophants and yes-men. He was laughing about her. "Evelyn?" Richard was saying into the speakerphone, swirling a glass of scotch. "God, no, she has no idea. The woman can barely balance a checkbook. I could sell the house out from under her, and she'd thank me for the moving boxes. I keep her around because it looks good for the shareholders to have a stable family man at the helm. But don't worry, the assets are diverted. If I ever decide to upgrade, she gets the crumbs." Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway, the bag of takeout food turning heavy in her hand. He wasn't just cheating on her emotionally, he was actively mocking her intelligence. He was betting against her. She closed the door silently, leaving the lunch on the assistant's desk, and walked out of the building. She didn't cry. She didn't confront him. That afternoon, she made a phone call to an old contact from her analyst days, a woman named Margaret Wu, who now ran a private equity firm in Singapore that specialized in hostile takeovers. "Margaret," Evelyn had said, sitting in her car in the parking garage, "I need to build a ghost ship." "A ghost ship?" Margaret had asked. "A company that doesn't exist on paper until it's too late. I need to buy debt. Specifically, Richard's debt." Over the next 4 years, Evelyn played the part of the oblivious wife perfectly. When Richard bought a yacht he couldn't afford, Evelyn smiled and said, "It's beautiful, honey." When he took out massive loans to fund risky expansions into biotech, using his personal stock as collateral, Evelyn signed the spousal consent forms without reading them, or so he thought. In reality, Evelyn was buying those loans. She used her inheritance from her grandmother. Along with funds, she had quietly invested in Bitcoin in 2011 Ian investment, Richard had mocked as magic internet money, to fund a shell company called Titanium Holdings. Titanium Holdings was aggressive. Whenever Richard's company, Sterling Dynamics, needed quick cash to cover a bad quarter, they went to private lenders. Those lenders, unbeknownst to Richard, were often selling that debt to Titanium. By the time they sat down at Le Bernardin, Titanium Holdings didn't just own Richard's debt. They owned the liens on his personal shares. The divorce settlement Richard's lawyers had drawn up was aggressive. Yes, it stripped Evelyn of any claim to his current assets. But Evelyn's lawyer, a shark named Harrison Miller, whom she had hired secretly, had inserted a liability transfer clause. Richard, being arrogant, thought this clause meant Evelyn was absolving herself of any company debts. He thought she was being cowardly, running away from the financial risks of his company. In reality, the clause stated that upon divorce, the primary debtor, Richard, acknowledged full personal responsibility for all loans held by Titanium Holdings, and in the event of default or significant life change, like a divorce decree, the lender, Titanium, had the right to call in the loans immediately or convert them into equity. Richard had signed the papers. He had triggered the clause. Now, sitting in the back of the SUV with Simon, Evelyn watched the tablet. "The notification has been sent to his lawyers," Simon said. "Titanium Holdings is calling in the debt, $450 million, due immediately." "He doesn't have the cash," Evelyn said simply. "He put it all into the Street Tropez villa and the new jet for Isabella." "Exactly," Simon replied. "Which means, per the contract, Titanium is exercising its right to convert the debt into Class A voting shares." Evelyn leaned back, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "How much of the company does that give us, Simon?" Simon adjusted his glasses. 51%. You don't just own half his empire, Miss Moore. You are the majority shareholder. You are the boss." Evelyn looked at her phone. She had a text from Richard. "Boarding the jet now. Don't wait up." She typed a reply, but didn't send it. Instead, she opened the airline app. She knew the tail number of his private jet because she was the one who managed the leasing contracts through another subsidiary. "Simon," she said, "call the airfield. Tell them the owner of the aircraft is grounding the flight for a mechanical inspection." Simon raised an eyebrow. "Is there a mechanical issue?" "There is now," Evelyn said. "The owner is revoking permission for the lessee to use the vehicle. Leave him on the tarmac. The wind at Teterboro Airport was biting, cutting through the thin silk of Isabella's designer blouse. She stood by the steps of the Gulfstream G, 650, shivering and scrolling through Instagram, waiting for Richard to finish yelling at the pilot. Richard Sterling was turning a shade of purple that clashed violently with his pinstripe suit. He was a man accustomed to the world bending to his will. Doors opened, traffic parted, and planes flew when he said they flew. But tonight, the world was standing still. What do you mean, administrative hold? Richard spat, getting inches from the pilot's face. Captain Miller, a man who had flown Richard for 6 years, didn't flinch. He looked uncomfortable, but resolute. I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, Miller said, his voice level. The instruction came directly from the leasing authority 5 minutes ago. The transponder has been locked remotely. If I turn these engines on, I lose my license. The aircraft is grounded, pending an ownership audit. I am the owner, Richard roared. I pay the lease. I pay your salary. Actually, sir, Miller said, looking at his clipboard, the lease is held by a subsidiary called Argus Logistics. They pay the salary, and they just sent a cease and desist order regarding your use of the asset. Richard blinked. Argus Logistics. The name sounded familiar vaguely. It was one of the dozen shell companies his CFO managed to handle overheads. Why would his own company ground his jet? It's a glitch, Richard snapped, turning back to Isabella. Just a clerical error. Probably some automated system flagging the divorce filing. I'll fix it. He pulled out his phone, the same phone he had used to mock his wife hours earlier, and dialed Bradford Haynes, his chief financial officer. It went straight to voicemail. He dialed his personal banker at Goldman. Voicemail. He dialed the flight concierge desk. Get me another jet. Now. I don't care what it costs. Get me a Challenger. A Falcon. I don't care. We need to be wheels up in 30 minutes. Certainly, Mr. Sterling, the voice on the other end chirped. I have a Citation X available. It will be $45,000 for the one-way to Nice. Shall I charge the card on file? The Centurion? Yes. Obviously, Richard barked. He waited. Isabella tapped her foot. Richard, my hair is getting frizzy. Can we please get inside? Just a second, babe, he muttered. Mr. Sterling, the concierge, came back on the line. The chirpy tone was gone, replaced by a professional chill. I'm afraid that card was declined. Richard felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his back. Declined? That's an unlimited card. Try it again. I did, sir. Code 05. Do not honor. I also tried the corporate Amex and your personal Visa Infinite. All accounts are returning a frozen by issuer status. Perhaps you'd like to wire the funds? Richard ended the call. His hand was shaking. This wasn't a glitch. A glitch was one card. 3 cards was an attack. Richard? Isabella whined. What is going on? Are we going or not? He looked at her. For the first time, he noticed how sharp her features were, how calculating her eyes looked under the airport floodlights. She wasn't looking at him with adoration anymore. She was looking at him with annoyance. Change of plans, Richard said, trying to keep his voice smooth. The banks are doing a security audit because of the settlement. Standard procedure. We'll fly out tomorrow morning commercial. First class, obviously. Isabella scoffed. Commercial? Richard, I have 3 trunks of luggage. I'm not flying commercial. It's just for one night, he snapped, losing his composure. Get in the car. They walked back to the town car that had dropped them off. The driver, a contract employee, was leaning against the hood. Take us back to the penthouse, Richard commanded, reaching for the door handle. The driver didn't move to open it. Sorry, Mr. Sterling. Ride was booked one way. I got another fare waiting at the terminal. I'll pay you double cash, Richard said, reaching for his wallet. He opened it. He had $200 in cash. Not enough to bribe a private driver in New York. App only, the driver said, getting into the front seat. Have a good night. The town car drove away, leaving Richard Sterling, a man worth on paper $3 billion, standing on the curb with his mistress and her Louis Vuitton luggage. Isabella looked at him, Then, at the empty road, she pulled out her phone. "Who are you calling?" Richard asked. "Uber," she said flatly. "And Richard, you're paying for the Lux. If your card works." It didn't. Isabella had to pay for the ride. The silence in the back of the Toyota Camry on the way back to Manhattan was deafening. Richard stared out the window, his mind racing. Who had the power to do this? The bank? The SEC? It never once occurred to him that it was the woman he had told to go feed the birds. Richard didn't sleep. He spent the night pacing the floor of his penthouse, a penthouse that, legally, he still owned, though the deed was held in a trust he hadn't checked in years. He drank the cheap scotch from the back of the cabinet because he was too paranoid to open the rare vintage, fearing it might somehow be catalogued against him. By 7 a.m., he had showered, shaved, and put on his war suit, a charcoal Tom Ford that usually terrified his subordinates. He was going to the office. He was going to fire Bradford. He was going to fire the bank. He was going to fix this. He arrived at Sterling Tower at 7:45 a.m. The glass skyscraper gleamed in the morning sun, a monument to his ego. He walked through the revolving doors, expecting the usual greeting from the security team. "Morning, Frank," Richard said, not breaking stride as he approached the executive turnstiles. Frank, the head of lobby security for 10 years, didn't smile. He stepped out from behind the desk, blocking the path. He was a large man, former NYPD, and he looked genuinely pained. "Mr. Sterling," Frank said, "I can't let you up." Richard stopped. He laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "Good one, Frank. I'm in a bad mood. Move." "I'm serious, sir. Your clearance was revoked at midnight. My orders are to confiscate your badge if you attempt entry." "Revoked? By who?" "I own the damn building, Frank. I am the CEO. "The order came from the chairman of the board," Frank said. "I am the chairman of the board," Richard shouted. People in the lobby, interns, junior analysts, coffee runners, stopped to watch. The great Richard Sterling, red-faced and screaming in his own lobby. Frank shook his head. "Not anymore, sir. Not as of this morning. Look, don't make me call the cops. They said you could go up to the boardroom for the 8 a.m. meeting, but I have to escort you. Visitor pass only." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. A visitor pass. For his own company. "Fine," Richard hissed. "Take me up. Someone is going to die for this." The elevator ride was silent. Frank stood with his hands clasped, staring at the numbers. Richard fumed, checking his phone. Still no service. His corporate account had been wiped from the device remotely. When the doors opened on the 40th floor, the atmosphere was different. Usually, the executive floor hummed with a respectful quiet. Today, it was frantic. Assistants were running with files. Lawyers he didn't recognize were standing in clusters, whispering. Richard stormed toward the boardroom. "Bradford," he yelled, spotting his CFO cowering near the water cooler. "What the hell is going on?" Bradford looked like he was about to vomit. "Richard, I didn't know until the audit came through last night. The debt covenants, they triggered everything." "What debt? The titanium loans?" "I signed that off to Evelyn." "That's the problem," Bradford whispered. "You didn't sign them off. You signed an acknowledgement of personal liability, and titanium called the note. When you defaulted, they exercised the convertibility clause. They took the stock, Richard. All of it." Richard shoved past him and kicked open the double oak doors of the boardroom. The entire board was there. 7 men and women who had spent years kissing his ring. They wouldn't look at him. They were studying their tablets, shifting in their Herman Miller chairs. And at the head of the table, his seat sat a figure. Richard expected a corporate raider. Maybe a shark from a hedge fund like BlackRock or Vanguard. Maybe an old rival. Instead, he saw Evelyn. She wasn't wearing the navy dress from yesterday. She was wearing a white power suit, tailored to perfection. Her hair, usually pulled back in a messy bun, was blown out in a sleek, professional style. She wore glasses he had never seen before, thick black frames that made her look severe. On the table in front of her sat a single file folder and a cup of tea. "You," Richard breathed. The word hung in the air like a curse. Get out of my chair." Evelyn didn't blink. She looked at him with the same detached clinical interest a biologist might have for a specimen in a jar. "Sit down, Richard," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight of authority that silenced the room. "We have a lot to get through." "This is a joke," Richard said, looking around the table. "You're letting her do this? She's a housewife. She doesn't know a profit and loss from a grocery list." "Actually," spoke up a man sitting to Evelyn's right. It was Simon Thorne. "Mrs. Sterling, excuse me, Miss Moore graduated summa cum laude in economics from Wharton. She also managed the books for this company from 1998 to 2003. I believe you were busy networking at parties during those years, Mr. Sterling." Richard gripped the back of a guest chair, his knuckles white. "You stole my company." "I purchased it," Evelyn corrected. "Legally, fairly, and at a discount, I might add, thanks to your poor management of the liquidity ratios." She opened the folder. "Let's keep this brief, Richard. As of 3 a.m., Titanium Holdings controls 51.4% of the voting shares of Sterling Dynamics. I have voted myself as interim CEO and chairwoman. The board has ratified the motion." She slid a piece of paper down the long mahogany table. It stopped perfectly in front of him. "This is your termination notice," she said. "For cause." "Cause?" Richard choked out. "What cause?" "Embezzlement," Evelyn said, calmly. "Using company funds for personal assets. Specifically, the lease on a villa in Street Tropez and the unauthorized purchase of a jet for personal companionship. The forensic audit is quite thorough. We're handing it over to the district attorney this afternoon." The room spun. Richard felt his knees give way, and he slumped into the chair. Prison. She was talking about prison. "You can't do this," he whispered. "We were married." "We were," Evelyn agreed. "And you told me I was drowning in your shadow. You told me to go feed the birds." She stood up. The board members, instinctively, sat up straighter. "I'm afraid I don't have time for bird-watching, Richard," she said, closing the folder. "I have a company to save. Security will escort you out. You have 1 hour to clear your personal effects from your office. Anything left after that becomes company property." "Evelyn, please," Richard said, his voice cracking. He looked small now. The arrogance had evaporated, leaving only a terrified, middle-aged man. "The deal. Can we renegotiate? The divorce settlement?" Evelyn looked at him, and for a second, he saw a flash of the woman who used to make him coffee in the morning, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "The ink is dry, Richard," she said, echoing his words from the restaurant. "And frankly, you were never cut out for this life anyway." She turned to the board. "Shall we begin with the quarterly projections?" Frank stepped forward, his hand heavy on Richard's shoulder. "Let's go, sir." As Richard was led out of the room, the last thing he heard was Evelyn's voice, clear and commanding, directing the future of his empire without missing a beat. He realized then, with a sickening jolt, that she hadn't just taken his money, she had taken his identity. But Richard Sterling wasn't the type to go quietly. As the elevator doors closed, cutting off the view of his former kingdom, a dark thought began to form in the shattered remnants of his mind. If he couldn't have the company, he would burn it down. He just needed to find a match. And he knew exactly who had the lighter. Richard Sterling sat on the edge of a bed in a Motel 6 Inches, New Jersey. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, a stark contrast to the Egyptian cotton sheets of his penthouse or the filtered air of his former office. His bespoke suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his eyes bloodshot. He had spent the last 6 hours frantically calling every contact in his phone. Most hadn't answered. The few who did had hung up the moment he asked for a loan. Evelyn had been thorough. She hadn't just taken his company. She had nuked his reputation. The press release about the embezzlement investigation had hit the Wall Street Journal wire at 9:30 a.m. By noon, Richard was a pariah. But Richard Sterling was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a man who believed the rules applied to everyone else. He stared at his reflection in the dark screen of his burner phone. "She thinks she knows everything," he muttered to the empty room. "She thinks she can just erase me." He reached into the hidden lining of his suit jacket and pulled out a small, silver USB drive. It was encrypted, biometric, and contained the only copy of Project Aether. While Evelyn had been meticulously auditing the company's known assets, Richard had been funneling R&D funds into a black ops project for the last 3 years. Project Aether wasn't just a new drug. It was a synthetic protein capability that could revolutionize gene therapy. It was worth billions. And because Richard had paranoid delusions of grandeur, he had kept the core data off the Sterling Dynamics servers. It existed only on this drive. Technically, it belonged to the company. Legally, selling it was corporate espionage and grand larceny. But Richard didn't care about laws anymore. He cared about survival and revenge. He dialed a number from memory. It was a number he had sworn never to call the direct line to his fiercest rival. Marcus Vane, a voice answered, after 2 rings. Smooth, predatory, and irritatingly calm. "It's Richard," Sterling said, his voice raspy. There was a pause. "Richard, I heard you had a rough morning. The news is saying something about embezzlement and a hostile takeover by your wife. I have to say, I didn't see that coming. I always thought she was just decoration." "Shut up, Marcus," Richard snapped. "I don't have time for your gloating. I have something you want." "I doubt that," Marcus chuckled. "You have no company, no assets, and a pending indictment. You're radioactive, Richard. I have ether." The silence on the other end was absolute. Richard smiled for the first time in 24 hours. He knew he had him. Rumors of ether had circulated in the biotech world for months, but no one knew if it was real. "I'm listening," Marcus said, his tone shifting from mockery to business. "The data is on a drive. The full sequence, the clinical trials, everything. It's not on the Sterling servers. Evelyn doesn't even know it exists. If she finds it, she'll lock it down. But if you buy it, Vane Biologics becomes the market leader overnight. And the price? 100 million, wired to an offshore account in the Caymans, and a flight to a non-extradition country. Tonight. That's a steep price for stolen property, Richard. It's a fire sale for the future of medicine, Marcus. Do we have a deal? Meet me at the Vane Biologics hangar at Teterboro. 10 p.m. Bring the drive. If the data validates, you get your money." Richard hung up. He felt a surge of adrenaline. He was going to win. He would take the money, disappear to Brazil or Thailand, and watch from a beach as Evelyn's company crumbled without its crown jewel. She would be left with a shell while he walked away with the real prize. He didn't know that Marcus Vane had pressed the record button the moment he saw Richard's number on the caller ID. The Vane Biologics hangar was a cavern of steel and light, housing a sleek Bombardier Global 7500. Marcus Vane stood by a glass table near the nose of the jet, flanked by 2 large security guards and a thin woman typing on a laptop. Marcus was everything Richard wasn't. Disciplined, fit, and meticulously careful. He wore a black turtleneck and slacks, looking more like a tech billionaire than a pharmaceutical tycoon. Richard walked in, clutching the USB drive like a lifeline. He looked disheveled, a fallen king trying to barter with the crown jewels he'd smuggled out in his pockets. "You look terrible, Richard," Marcus said, not offering a hand. "Let's just get this done," Richard grunted, tossing the drive onto the glass table. "Verify it. Then wire the money." Marcus nodded to the woman with the laptop. She picked up the drive, inserted it, and began typing. "So," Marcus said, pouring himself a water, "how did she do it?" "Evelyn. I met her once at a gala in 2015. She seemed quiet." "She's a snake," Richard spat. "She played the long game. She bought my debt, Marcus. Can you believe that? She used her own inheritance to buy the loans I took out to build this industry." "Smart," Marcus admitted. "Ruthless. I like her." "She's going to ruin the company," Richard insisted. "She's an accountant, not a visionary. That's why you need ether. You're the only one who can actually bring it to market." The woman at the laptop looked up. "The encryption key works, Mr. Vane. The files are here. Project Ether. It looks authentic. The molecular structures are incredible. Was in founder. And the 7. Marcus smiled. Well, Richard, it seems you weren't lying. The money, Richard demanded. Wire it now. Marcus pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times. Done. Richard's phone buzzed. He checked it. A notification from a Cayman Bank app he had set up years ago. Deposit received. $100 million USD. Relief washed over Richard so intensely, he almost collapsed. He had done it. He was free. Thank you, Marcus, Richard said, a smirk returning to his face. Pleasure doing business. Now, about that flight? Oh, the flight is ready, Marcus said. He gestured to the jet. But you're not on it. Richard froze. What? I said. You're not on it. Marcus looked past Richard, toward the hangar doors. I think your ride is here. The hangar doors groaned as they began to open. But it wasn't a taxi. It was a convoy of 3 black SUVs with government plates. Richard spun around to Marcus. You set me up? No, Richard, Marcus said, picking up the USB drive. I didn't set you up. I just secured my own position. I gave you the data. We had a deal. We did, Marcus agreed. But about an hour before you called me, I received a call from the new CEO of Sterling Dynamics. Miss Moore seems to know you very well, Richard. She predicted you would try to sell Ether. Richard's blood ran cold. She knew? She didn't know about Ether specifically, Marcus explained, but she knew about the off-book R&D allocation in the forensic audit. She traced the funds. She knew you had something, and she knew you were desperate enough to sell it to me. Marcus walked closer to Richard. She offered me a choice. I could buy stolen goods from a fugitive and face a federal lawsuit that would tie up Vane Biologics for a decade. Or I could help her recover stolen company property. You betrayed me for her? She offered me a cross-licensing agreement, Richard, Marcus said with a grin. Legally, if I help recover the drive, Vane Biologics gets 20% of the patent rights to whatever is on this drive. It's a brilliant deal. 0 risk, massive reward. And I don't have to go to prison. The SUVs stopped. Doors flew open. Men in FBI windbreakers stepped out, guns drawn. Richard Sterling, one agent shouted. Hands where we can see them. Richard backed away, looking from Marcus to the agents. The money? I have the money? Check your phone again, Richard, Marcus said softly. Richard looked down. The banking app refreshed. Transaction reversed. Reason. Sender canceled. Funds frozen. By Doge order. It was a dummy transfer, Marcus said. Evelyn's idea. She wanted you to feel the win before you lost it. She said it was poetic. Richard looked at the FBI agents closing in. He looked at the jet he would never fly on. He looked at Marcus Vane, who was now casually handing the USB drive to the lead agent as evidence. She planned this, Richard whispered. The whole thing, the meeting, the transfer. She knew exactly what I would do. She owns you, Richard, Marcus said, almost pityingly. She told me something on the phone. She said, Richard always bets on his own genius. He never bets on the people he steps on. She was right. As the handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists, the reality of his situation finally settled in. He wasn't just broke. He wasn't just divorced. He was going to federal prison for corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, and embezzlement. He was led toward the SUV, his head bowed. As he was shoved into the back seat, he saw a figure standing in the shadows of the hangar entrance, near a parked limousine. He squinted against the floodlights. It was Evelyn. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She was just watching, her face impassive. She held a phone to her ear. As the FBI car drove past her, Richard saw her look him directly in the eye. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a goodbye. He turned his head to watch her through the rear window until she disappeared into the night. The trial of Richard Sterling became the most watched financial drama since Enron. It wasn't just the amount of money involved, though the embezzlement charges totaled over $45, $2 million. It was the sheer Shakespearean nature of the betrayal. The Sterling case dominated headlines, with news outlets painting Richard as the Icarus of the pharmaceutical world and Evelyn as the quiet architect of his demise. Richard's defense team was a disaster. Because his personal assets were frozen by the Department of Justice, pending the outcome of the corporate espionage charges, and his hidden offshore accounts had been flagged by international regulators thanks to the dummy transfer. He couldn't afford the high-powered legal team he had kept on retainer for decades. He was forced to rely on a court-appointed defense attorney, a weary man named Alan Gresher, who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. The courtroom was packed every day. On the left side, the prosecution, led by a sharp-witted assistant U.S. attorney named Sarah Jenkins. On the right, Richard, looking pale and significantly smaller, in a suit that no longer fit his wasting frame. But the real blow came on the third day of testimony. The prosecution calls Isabella Vance to the stand. Richard's head snapped up. He hadn't seen Isabella since the night at the airport. He assumed she had fled back to Europe. He certainly didn't expect to see her walking into the courtroom, dressed modestly in a gray cardigan, avoiding his gaze entirely. She had cut a deal. Immunity in exchange for testimony regarding the night of the theft. Miss Vance, the prosecutor began, did the defendant, Richard Sterling, discuss his plans for the USB drive containing the trade secrets of Sterling Dynamics? He did, Isabella said, her voice trembling slightly. He told me in the car, on the way to the hangar. He said it was his insurance policy. He said he was going to sell it to Marcus Vane for $100 million and that we would live like kings in Brazil. Did he mention that the data belonged to the company? Yes, Isabella replied, finally looking at Richard. Her eyes were cold. He said, Evelyn thinks she owns the company, but I own the genius. I'm taking the only thing that matters. Richard lunged forward. You liar! You begged me to take you with me. You packed the bags. Order! The judge slammed his gavel. Mr. Sterling, another outburst, and you will be removed. Richard slumped back, his face burning. He realized then that Isabella had never loved him. She had loved the jet. She had loved the black card. And the moment those were gone, she had looked for the nearest lifeboat. That lifeboat was the prosecution. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't Isabella. It was the forensic evidence provided by Titanium Holdings. Evelyn didn't testify. She didn't have to. Her lawyers submitted a 500-page dossier detailing every unauthorized transfer Richard had made over the last 5 years. The villa in Street Tropez, paid for by siphoning funds from the employee pension pool. The diamond necklace for Isabella, billed as optical equipment for the lab. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreman stood up to read the verdict, the courtroom was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. On the count of grand larceny, we find the defendant, Richard Sterling, guilty. On the count of corporate espionage, guilty. On the count of wire fraud, guilty. The counts went on. 22 felonies. Richard didn't cry. He just stared at the table, his mind unable to process the reality. He was Richard Sterling. He was a visionary. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. This happened to other people. The judge, a stern woman who had zero patience for white-collar crime, looked over her glasses at him. Mr. Sterling, you have displayed a breathtaking level of arrogance and greed. You stole from your own employees, you betrayed your shareholders, and when you were caught, you attempted to sell dangerous medical technology to a rival for personal gain. I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for the first 10. The gavel banged. It sounded like a gunshot. As the bailiffs moved in to cuff him, Richard turned to look at the gallery. He was looking for her. He wanted to scream at her, to curse her. But Evelyn wasn't there. She was at the office, working 12 months later. The rebranding of Sterling Dynamics was subtle but powerful. The name Sterling was stripped from the building. The company was now simply More Biotech. The culture of the company had shifted overnight. The frat boy atmosphere Richard had cultivated, the drinking lunches, the aggressive sales tactics, the focus on stock price over science was gone. In its place was a quiet, intense focus on innovation. Evelyn Moore sat in the corner office. She had remodeled it completely. The dark mahogany and leather were replaced with light oak, glass, and living plants. It felt like a greenhouse, not a fortress. Her assistant, a young man named Leo, knocked on the door. Miss. More? The board is ready for the Q3 presentation, and your son is on line 1. Evelyn smiled. Put Daniel through. Daniel Sterling was 21 now, finishing his degree in bioengineering at MIT. For years, he had been estranged from his father, who viewed him as too soft. He had been distant from his mother, too, viewing her as weak for staying with Richard. But the last year had changed everything. Daniel had watched his mother not only survive the divorce, but dismantle a corrupt regime and rebuild a billion-dollar company from the ashes. He didn't just love her now, he respected her. Hey, Mom, Daniel's voice came through the speaker. Just wanted to say good luck with the earnings call. I saw the stock price this morning. You're up 14%. It's not about the stock price, Daniel, Evelyn said gently. It's about ether. I know. Dad wanted to sell it. You're actually going to use it. We launch the clinical trials next month, Evelyn said. It's going to cure sickle cell anemia, Daniel. It's not just a profit center. It's a legacy. I'm proud of you, Mom. Really. I'll see you at Thanksgiving, honey. She hung up and walked to the window. The city of New York sprawled out below her. It was the same view Richard had looked at for 20 years, but he had only ever seen his own reflection in the glass. Evelyn looked through it. She checked her watch. She had one more appointment before the board meeting, an appointment she had put off for a year. Leo, she called out, have the car brought around. I'm going to Otisville. Leo paused. The prison, ma'am? Yes. It's time to close the book. The visitation room at the Federal Correctional Institution at Otisville was stark, smelling of bleach and despair. Richard sat behind the plexiglass partition. He looked different. The hair that had been carefully dyed was now completely gray. The weight he had lost during the trial hadn't come back. He looked frail, but his eyes still held a spark of that old, toxic fire. When Evelyn sat down, he didn't pick up the phone immediately. He just stared at her. She looked radiant, not in a flashy way, but in a way that spoke of deep, unshakable peace. She wore a simple cream suit, and her hands were devoid of rings. Richard picked up the receiver. You came to gloat? He rasped. His voice was scratchy from disuse. Evelyn picked up her side of the phone. No, Richard. I came to give you this. She slid a single envelope through the document slot. Richard stared at it. What is it? Divorce papers? We're already done, Evelyn. Open it. Richard tore open the envelope. Inside was a glossy brochure. On the cover was a picture of a state-of-the-art medical facility. The title read, The Richard Sterling Center for Pediatric Oncology. Richard looked up, confused. What is this? I liquidated your remaining assets, Evelyn said calmly. The ones the government didn't seize. The hidden trust in the Cook Islands you thought I didn't know about? Simon found it 3 months ago. Richard's face went white. That was my retirement. That was $5 million. It was, Evelyn agreed. And now, it's a cancer wing at St. Jude's, in your name. Richard slammed the phone against the glass. You stole my money to build a hospital? Why? To mock me? No, Evelyn said, her voice steady. To redeem you. Richard stopped. He blinked, the anger momentarily replaced by shock. You spent your whole life trying to be a titan, Evelyn said softly. You wanted your name on buildings. You wanted a legacy. Well, I gave you one. But instead of a legacy of greed and embezzlement, I gave you a legacy of healing. People will walk into that center and thank God for the name Richard Sterling. They won't know you're sitting in here. They won't know you were a monster. They'll just know you saved their child. Richard stared at the brochure. His hands were shaking. Why? He whispered. After everything I did to you, the affairs, the insults, I tried to destroy you. Because, Evelyn said, standing up, I'm not you, Richard. I don't destroy things. I fix them. I fix the company. I fix the finances. And now, I've fixed your name. She buttoned her jacket. This is the last time I'll come here. Daniel might visit when he's ready, but that's up to him. As for me, I have a company to run. Evelyn, Richard called out, pressing his hand against the glass. She stopped at the door. Did you ever love me? He asked. It was the question of a desperate man, looking for one scrap of the past to hold on to. Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him, for the last time. I loved the man I thought you were in 1998, she said. But that man never really existed, did he? He was just a reflection in my eyes. She turned and walked out. Richard sat alone in the booth. He looked down at the brochure, the Richard Sterling Center. For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling cried, not out of anger or self-pity, but out of a crushing, overwhelming sense of shame. She had beaten him completely. She hadn't just taken his money, she had taken his hatred. She had responded to his cruelty with a kindness that burned worse than any insult. Outside, the autumn air was crisp. Evelyn stepped into the waiting town car. Back to the office, Miss Moore? The driver asked. Evelyn looked at the sky, clear and blue. No, she said, smiling. Take me to the airport. I'm taking the jet to Paris for the climate summit. The board can handle the meeting. Which jet, ma'am? The G650, she said, the one with my name on the tail. As the car pulled away, leaving the prison behind, Evelyn Moore didn't look back. She took out her pen, a simple, functional Pilot G2, not a Mont Blanc, and opened her notebook. There was work to do, and for the first time in 20 years, the empire wasn't just profitable, it was hers. And that is the story of how Richard Sterling learned the hardest lesson of all. Never underestimate the person who knows where the bodies are buried, especially if she's the one balancing the books. Richard wanted a trophy wife, but he forgot that trophies are just heavy objects, and if you drop them, they can crush you. What do you think? Did Evelyn go too far by taking everything, or was turning his hidden millions into a cancer center the ultimate poetic justice? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of corporate revenge and redemption, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama stories. Thanks for watching, and remember, read the fine print.